Imagine making one tiny mistake, a mistake so enormous that it changes the course of human history forever. Now here's a question. What if I told you the most famous discovery in history was never supposed to happen? And what if I told you the man who discovered America wasn't even looking for America? Would you believe me? Stay with me until the very end, because this story might completely change the way you think about Christopher Columbus. And along the way, you'll also discover why millions of people today no longer see him as a hero. Let's rewind more than 500 years, back to a time when the Atlantic Ocean was one of the greatest mysteries on Earth. Most maps were incomplete. Huge parts of the world were still blank, and sailing into the open ocean felt less like an adventure and more like a death sentence. Now imagine one man standing up and saying, "I can sail straight across that ocean and find a brand new route to India." You can probably guess what happened next. Almost everyone thought he was crazy, but that was only the beginning. That man's name was Christopher Columbus. But why was he so obsessed with sailing west? At the time, Europe desperately wanted access to the riches of Asia. Spices, silk, precious goods that were worth a fortune. Some were literally worth their weight in gold. But there was one major problem. The traditional land routes had become increasingly difficult and expensive, largely because they passed through territories controlled by the Ottoman Empire. European kingdoms wanted another way, a faster and cheaper way. Columbus believed he had the answer. His idea sounded simple. If the Earth is round, why not reach Asia by sailing west? Here's the funny part. The idea itself wasn't revolutionary. Educated people had known the Earth was round for centuries. Columbus's real mistake wasn't believing the Earth was round. It was believing the planet was much smaller than it actually is. One massive miscalculation that would change history forever. Think about this. What happens when you underestimate the distance between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles? Exactly what happened to Columbus. He genuinely believed he could reach Asia after only a few weeks at sea. What he didn't know was that an entire continent was sitting directly in his path. Even so, convincing people wasn't easy. Columbus spent years traveling from one royal court to another, asking kings and queens to finance his expedition. Most of them gave him the same answer, no, over and over and over again. Until finally, Spain said yes. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agreed to fund the voyage. 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. 3 small wooden ships about to change the world forever. August 3rd, 1492. The ships pulled away from the harbor. Their destination? Nobody really knew. Imagine sailing into an ocean where no one could tell you what was waiting beyond the horizon. No GPS, no engines, no radio, no satellite maps. The first week passed. Nothing. Then the second week. Still nothing. By the third week, fear started spreading through the crew. Some sailors became convinced the ocean simply went on forever. Others believed they'd never see home again. Fresh water was running low. Food was beginning to spoil. Some days there wasn't enough wind to move the ships at all. Then something even stranger happened. The compass started behaving unpredictably. But back then, the sailors thought nature itself was warning them to turn back. Some even believed they were sailing toward the end of the world. Before long, whispers of mutiny spread across the ships. Some crew members wanted to force Columbus to turn around. Imagine believing you're only days away from death, while your captain keeps saying, just a little farther. Then, after more than 2 months at sea, something changed. A floating tree branch drifted past the ships. To most people, those might seem like ordinary things, but to exhausted sailors, they meant only one thing. Land was close. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, a sailor suddenly cried out, "Land!" Instantly, everyone rushed onto the deck. Weeks of fear, weeks of uncertainty, weeks of wondering if they'd ever make it home, and finally, there it was, land. But there was one small problem. It wasn't India, not even close. Columbus had actually reached an island in the Caribbean, but he didn't realize that. He believed he had arrived near Asia. That's why he called the people he met Indians, a name based on a mistake. But here's the question that changes everything. Did Christopher Columbus ever realize he discovered an entirely new continent? No. Even until the day he died, he believed he had reached Asia. Think about how incredible that is. The man remembered as history's most famous explorer never truly understood what he had found. But here's the thing. The real story didn't begin when Columbus reached land. It began the moment Europeans stepped onto it. Imagine meeting people who had never heard of Europe, never seen a sailing ship like yours, never imagined another world existed beyond the horizon. Many of the indigenous people welcomed the newcomers with food, fresh water, and gifts. To them, these strangers had simply arrived from somewhere beyond the sea. But there was no way they could have known what was coming next. Because this wasn't just the arrival of a few ships. It was the beginning of a completely new chapter in human history, one that would change two continents forever. News of Columbus's voyage spread across Europe like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to go. Everyone dreamed of gold. Everyone wanted a share of this mysterious new world. Before long, more ships crossed the Atlantic. But these weren't just expeditions of exploration anymore. They carried soldiers, weapons, settlers, and royal orders to claim land for European crowns. So where did everything start to go wrong? At first, many Europeans searched for gold. When they realized it wasn't as easy to find as they'd hoped, their priorities changed. They wanted land, resources, and labor. Across many regions, indigenous communities were forced to work, required to pay tribute, and those who resisted often faced brutal violence. But as devastating as that was, the deadliest enemy wasn't carrying a sword. It was something no one could even see: disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses traveled across the Atlantic with the Europeans. In Europe, these diseases had existed for centuries. Many people had developed at least some level of immunity after generations of exposure. But for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, everything was different. Their immune systems had never encountered these diseases before. They had no natural protection. Imagine an invisible enemy entering an entire city. No one knows what it is. No one understands how it spreads. People begin getting sick, then entire villages, and no one can stop it. The consequences were catastrophic. In some regions, a huge percentage of the population disappeared within just a few years. Communities that had existed for centuries began to collapse. The loss was almost impossible to comprehend. Many historians believe disease became one of the single greatest causes of death following European contact. Combined with warfare, forced labor, displacement, famine, and social collapse, the human cost reached into the millions over the decades and centuries that followed. It wasn't one single event. It was a chain reaction, one that continued for generations. Now stop and think about this. If Columbus had turned his ships around just a few days earlier, would North and South America look the same? Would the world's most spoken languages be different? One voyage, one decision, one mistake in a set of calculations triggered a chain of events that reshaped the course of history forever. But here's something most people never expect. The name America doesn't come from Columbus, not even close. So where does it actually come from? From another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci was one of the first Europeans to clearly argue that the lands discovered across the Atlantic weren't Asia at all, but an entirely new continent, a new world. So Columbus got there first, but history didn't even give him the name. And here's another twist. Do you think Columbus was the first European to ever reach the Americas? He wasn't. Around 500 years before him, Viking explorers had already reached parts of North America. They even attempted settlements in places like Newfoundland. But since those voyages didn't lead to long-term contact, their discovery faded into obscurity, and history moved on. Which leads to a strange realization. The version of history most people know isn't the full story. It's just the version that survived. Now zoom out for a second. Think about how fragile history really is. One navigation error, one underestimated distance, one decision to keep sailing instead of turning back, and the entire global map could have looked completely different. No transatlantic empires, no rapid colonization of the Americas, no massive exchange of crops, animals, and diseases between continents. A completely different world trajectory. All because of a miscalculation about the size of the Earth. So now here's the real question. Was Columbus a genius who changed the world? Or just a man who got extremely lucky because of one critical mistake? Or maybe both at the same time? Tell me what you think in the comments, because this is one of those stories where the more you dig, the less simple the answer becomes. And if you enjoyed this cinematic dive into history, there's a lot more where this came from. Because the past is full of moments that look like destiny, but might have just been accidents waiting to happen.